And if he loved me, as I said before, Mr. Carroll, I was selfish. On the morning of the day we were to go, my husband was in Nashville, you know. Mr. Warren came to the house in his car. He showed me that he had reserved a drawing room for us to New York. In order that we would not be seen together, he gave me one of the railroad tickets. I was to reach the Union Station 10 minutes before train time. If you recall, the train on which we were to go was quite late that night. We planned not to talk to one another at the station until after boarding the train. Morning would have published news of the scandal broadcast, but until the irrevocable step had been taken, we determined to avoid gossip. And, Mr. Carroll, I was then what is called a good woman. My faithlessness up to that time, and to this moment, had been mental, and mental only. When he left me that morning, he took with him my suitcase. We had agreed that I was not to take a trunk, that I was to buy a trousseau in New York. I looked upon it almost as a honeymoon. He took my suitcase to the Union Station and checked it there. I did not see him again that day. Toward evening, knowing that my husband was not due back until the following morning, and realizing that I could not leave Evelyn alone in the house, I suggested that she spend the night with Hazel Gresham. She was surprised, knowing that I dread to be alone at night, but was ready enough to go. I was not overcome with either emotion or shame when I told her good-bye that afternoon. I was so hungry for happiness that I was dead to the other emotions. I went to the station that night in a streetcar. I had telephoned in advance and learned that the train was late. The night was the worst of the winter, bitterly cold. When I reached the station, I saw that Roland was already there, and as he saw me enter he left through the opposite door, walking out to the platform which parallels the railroad tracks. Then from the outside he motioned me to follow. He wanted to talk to me, but would not risk doing so where we might be seen. I sat down for a while, then, as casually as I could, followed him onto the station platform. I saw him down at the far end and near the baggage room. Again he motioned to me to follow him, and he started out past the baggage room into the railroad yards. I was very grateful to him. He was taking no risk of our being seen together. I followed slowly, not seeing him, but knowing that he would be waiting for me out there. You understand where I mean? It is in that section of the railroad yards where through trains leave their early morning Pullmans. The tracks are parallel to Atlantic Avenue, and also the main line tracks running into the Union Station shed. I was conscious of the intense cold, but excitement buoyed me up. I passed through the gate which ordinarily bars passengers from the tracks, but which that night had either been left open or opened by Roland. The wind, as I stepped from under the shelter of the station shed, was terrific, howling across the yards, stinging with sleet. It was very slippery underfoot. I had to watch closely. And I was just a trifle nervous because here and there through the yards I could see lanterns. Yard workers and track walkers, I presume. And occasionally the headlights of a switch engine zigzagged across the tracks. I was afraid I'd be caught in the glare. Finally I saw Warren. He had walked about 150 yards down the track and was standing in the shelter of the Pullman office building. It was very dark there, just enough light for me to make out his silhouette. I started forward, then stopped, frightened, for I distinctly saw the figure of a man coming into the yards from Atlantic Avenue. From the moment I noticed him, I had the peculiar impression that the man had not only seen Mr. Warren and intended speaking to him, but also that the meeting was not unexpected. I stopped where I was and strained my eyes through the darkness. I could not see much, save that they were talking. Of course I could hear nothing. I was shivering, but more with premonition of tragedy than with the terrific cold. Then suddenly I saw the two shadows merge. The combined shadows whirled strangely. I knew that Mr. Warren was fighting with this other man. I started forward again. Then I saw one of the shadows step back from the other. There was the flash of a revolver. No noise, because a train was rolling under the shed at the moment. But I saw the flash of the gun. I stood motionless, horrified. I didn't advance, didn't run. I knew that the man who had been shot was Mr. Warren. I didn't know what to do. I felt suddenly lost, hopeless. And watching, I saw one figure stoop and lift the prostrate man. He dragged him across the tracks to the inky darkness between the Pullman offices and the rear of the baggage room. I don't know what he did there, but I remember looking toward Atlantic Avenue and seeing a yellow taxicab parked against the curb. I could see that there was no one in the driver's seat, and while I watched, I saw the man who had done the shooting drag Mr. Warren's body to the taxicab. It was dark in the street. The arc light on the corner was out. I saw him throw Mr. Warren's body into the taxicab. It was then that I turned and fled toward the station. I can't tell you how I felt. At a time like that one doesn't pause to analyze one's emotional reactions. I was conscious of horror, of that and the idea that I must save myself. And then the thought struck me that perhaps Mr. Warren was not dead. Perhaps he was only badly wounded. If that were the case, I knew that he would freeze to death in the cab. It was necessary to get to him. By that time I had reached the waiting room. I saw his suitcase, and then, Mr. Carroll, I thought of something else. Something which made it imperative that I get to Mr. Warren. She stopped suddenly. Carroll, eyes wide with interest, motioned her on. "You thought of something? Something which made it necessary for you to get to him?" "Yes. I remembered that he had in his pocket the check for my suitcase. He had checked it himself that day. I realized in a flash that there would be a police investigation, and the minute that checkroom stub was found, the detectives would have followed it up. They would have discovered my suitcase. My name would then have been indelibly linked with his in that way. So there were two reasons why I knew I must get into that taxicab. To recover the suitcase check, and to either assure myself that he was dead or else take him where he could get expert medical attention. Almost before I knew what I was doing, I seized his suitcase, which he had left on the floor of the waiting room. I left the station along with several passengers who had come in on the local train. I called the taxicab. I told him to drive me to some place on East End Avenue, gave him some address which I knew was a long distance away, so that I would have time to learn if he was dead, and if he wasn't, to get him to a doctor's, and if he was, to find the check, the finding of which in his pocket would have connected me with the affair. He was dead." She paused, choked, and went on gamely. "I got out of the taxicab when it slowed down at a railroad crossing. I walked half the distance back to town, then caught the last street car home." Her voice died away. Carroll relaxed slowly. Then a puzzled frown creased his forehead. "The man who did the actual shooting," he said quietly.